The Atlantic Slave Trade.
The Atlantic slave trade took place from the 16th century to the 19th century. It was a system of trade that took African peoples, mostly from Western Africa, and brought them to the Americas for forced labor. It took place across the Atlantic Ocean, where Europeans would trade and take Africans for slaves in return for manufactured and luxury goods. An immense amount of slaves were sent to the New World, where the slave population would soon surpass the non-slave population. In the New World, they would undergo difficult labor with no pay, and they quickly became a prime economic source in the Americas and European nations. Due to harsh conditions and extremely unfair treatment, African slaves would start rebellions, often failing, for equal rights and independence.
The Atlantic slave trade involved many African nations and European nations, mainly the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch.
Several abolitionist groups existed, such as the Society of Gentlemen, and many Quakers held power in the slavery abolitionist movements. A few were William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, who told the Parliament to treat black individuals equally.
A famous slave was Olaudah Aquino, whose autobiography aided in the passing of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which ended slave trade in Britain.
Economically, the slaves brought over to the Americas allowed for inexpensive labor to plantation owners. The slaves were most often assigned to sugar production, a crop that was very labor-intensive, and they were also often beaten and abused. You want my slave?
Oh
Here's
yeah.
$1.
Here's $1. Thank you, sir.
Ow.
Go! Ow!
Ow. My family.
Oh no! Die!
Ah.
Many historians argue that the reason for Britain's wealth during this time was due to the fact that slaves were able to generate profit in the Americas and bring economic prosperity. Also, African slaves were held accountable for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. This was also a large source of income for the British government at the time.
A new social hierarchy created new classes of individuals such as mulattoes and Creoles. Mulattoes were people born from one European parent and one African parent. Creoles were Europeans that were born in the New World.
Slaves that were taken to the Americas were no longer allowed to practice their religion and were often converted to the religion of their master, which was most often Christianity.
The slave trade had many effects on population, including the decrease of American Indians due to disease and conflict with Europeans. African and European populations increased due to the more diverse selection of food and goods brought over by trade.
(1562). The first voyage with 300 African slaves was made by John Hawkins and other English traders when he left Plymouth and traded with the Spaniards and Portuguese for sugar, spices, jewels, and leather. Between 1564 and 1565, with the support of Queen Elizabeth I, John Hawkins made another trip, but this time with 200 more African slaves, making 500 total, and trades them for jewelry and precious metals. In 1567, on his third trip with the same amount of slave, Hawkins was scuppered by the Spanish, where some faced the Inquisition, some were forced into slavery, and some faced death. Only approximately 18% of the crew returned.
18. The Guinea Company is established by King James I on the ports of Africa. This is the first private slave trading company in Africa. In 1619, the beginning of tobacco growing by African slave begins in Virginia. In 1672, after the downfall of the Royal African Company, it was rebuilt to modulate the English slave trade, and by the 80s, it was trading around 5,000 slaves a year.
1727, British Quakers show their dislike of the Atlantic slave trade with their yearly meetings book, and the British are deemed the largest African slave trading country. By 1765, the British slave trade was objected by the Granville Sharp with the case of Jonathan Strong. And then in 1772, American Quaker John Wooman and anti-slavery supporters traveled to England to gain support of the English Quakers. By 1772, Lord Mansfield states that enslaved peoples are not able to be forced to return to the West Indies, but does not authorize slave freedom in England. Between 1772 and 1773, as a result of joining a military expedition in an attempt to calm slave rebellions in Surham, John Stedman is shocked by the treatment they receive. He then publishes a renowned abolitionist literature work, The Narrative of a 5-Year Expedition against the Revolted Negroes of Suriname. And then in 1774, the anti-slavery tract, Thoughts Upon Slavery, was published by early leader of the Methodist movement, John Wesley. In 1775, to collect evidence on the slave trade, the Royal Commission was created. And then in 1783, the first petition to end slave trade was signed by 273 Quakers in the London Yearly Meeting and was shown the Parliament. 1788, the Plymouth Committee of Abolitionists was created and was the first public abolitionist meeting. And then in 1790, the first abolitionist bill was bestowed to the House of Commons by William Wilberforce, but does not pass. In 1792, the abolition of slave trade was voted in favor by the House of Commons, but when it reached the House of Lords, it was rejected.
Beginning of the 19th century, the British Parliament abolishes the transatlantic slave trade. The following year, United States abolishment of slavery would take effect. In order to suppress the illegal slave trade that was currently going on, the British West African Squadron was formed, and within 70 years, over 150,000 people were set free by the squadron. In 1823, the complete abolition of slavery was sought by the Anti-Slavery Commitment in London. In 1833, the Abolishment of Slavery Act of 1833 was passed in order to completely abolish slavery in Britain, and in August 1834, the emancipation of slaves would take place in the British West Indies. After the peaceful protests in Trinidad, the apprentice system was removed, so all former slaves received full emancipation in 1838.
The American Civil War. The 13th Amendment was passed, which abolished slavery in the United States of America in 1865. And in 1888, Brazil abolished slavery.
To be sold on Thursday, the 3rd day of August next, a cargo of 94 prime, healthy Negroes consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls just arrived in the brigantine Dembia, Francis Bear Master from Sierra Leone by David John Diaz. The picture is of a handbill advertising a slave auction in South Carolina in 1769. It depicts a black male, female, and boy. It also shows how many of each will be available for purchase in the auction. Handbills like these were prevalent in society because they alerted the general public as to where they could buy and sell slaves. Slavery and the slave trade created tension between the Europeans and the slaves and Africans. Some people from the time have said that racism did not start slavery, but slavery started racism. The Atlantic slave trade is held accountable for the instability and expansion of politics in Africa during the 16th to 19th century. Many kings were able to benefit and prosper off the wealth that the slave trade brought in, and the expansive kingdoms were formed as a result as well.
The location of the Atlantic slave trade on the Atlantic Ocean made it the ideal area to ship slaves and other manufactured and luxury goods. It was in the center of many thriving nations such as the ones in Europe, South America, the United States of America, and Africa, the region where African peoples were taken and forced into slavery. African culture was assimilated into the New World with slaves and their owners, and in Africa, European languages mixed with ones native to African land, forming new ones such as Swahili.
Slave traders used large cargo ships that could carry large amounts of slaves, ranging from 200 to 600 slaves on one ship, that was multi-sail powered and could travel long distances. New technologies brought to Africa and European slave traders such as pots, pans, manufactured and luxury goods, and also military technology, specifically gunpowder, and guns were brought over to Africa.
Boats from Africa to the New World. The slaves would be shackled in small tight compartments in the hull of the boat. They were fed very little food, and they were subject to abuse.
The Atlantic slave trade took place in the vast majority of the Atlantic Ocean. The majority of the slaves in the slave trade were sent to South America, where the Spanish and Portuguese settlements were located. A good portion of the slaves were also sent to the Caribbean islands. A very small amount of the African slaves were sent to North America. They were forced to go through harsh labor for no pay, and because of this, rebellions for equality and rights often broke out. The result of this has changed cultural and society in the world today by affecting and shaping racial norms.